This conference will now be recorded.
So, Nicole, when you were in high school, did you were all of these other West Orange kids still in high school too?
Yes, they were. They
Oh,
were
were they
like,
freshmen then?
yeah, like Karem, I think was a freshman. Olivia was like a sophomore. Asa was a sophomore. Jake a sophomore. Yeah.
Okay.
They
So,
always
Karen, you're gonna
seniors.
be a junior then, right?
Huh?
So, Karen's gonna be a junior then? Okay.
Well, I haven't seen you guys in like a year. Sorry.
All right. I don't know where the other West Orange kids are, but for the rest of you, I shared you to a folder earlier this morning, and you should see that in your emails. And these are what the partnerships are going to be. So unfortunately, Sarah dropped out yesterday, so now we have an odd number. So Amalie, I unfortunately had to make you a Maverick, but I think you can handle it. It'll be fine. Don't worry. So Amalie, you'll be a Maverick. The rest of you will be in pairs though, and you're also assigned a side. Some of you had preferences, some did not. But this week you're only responsible for learning one side. Um, all right, so today mostly we're just going to be discussing cases, working on cases, and practicing delivery a little bit. So you'll have about 2.5 hours today to work on your case. In the morning, in about like 15 minutes, I'll give a lecture on case construction just so that like it can be kind of guided and you're not going in blind. You'll have research time in the afternoon, and Nicole will also give a rebuttal lecture in the afternoon. Stan said to have cases done by the end of the day tomorrow. I think we might be able to do it a little bit earlier, but we'll see how everything goes. Okay, so for those of you who just popped in, you should have gotten an email earlier this morning sharing you to a Drive folder with you and your partner's name and also the side that you'll be responsible for. And so for all of the work that you do in this camp and all of the prep, make sure to put that in the folder so that Nicole and I can review it. And Nicole, it's just in the PFPP folder. All right. So I'm going to give the case construction lecture at 9:30. So I want you all to just spend this time opening modes of communication. I gather the West Orange kids already have like numbers and stuff, but if you do not, maybe set up a Google chat. I would recommend exchanging phone numbers so you can text or call during round. If you already have that set up, take this time to kind of start discussing which arguments you like, what you don't like. I know you've all done a little bit of preliminary research, but now you also know your sides. So take about 10 minutes to do that. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started now. Hopefully you all can see. Nicole, can you see my screen? Okay, great. All right, so we're going to get started here, and today we're going to talk about case construction. All right, so you've all written cases. I've seen all of them before, and I think that you've gotten a pretty good handle on it. But now I want to take your case writing skills to the next level so that it becomes more strategic and more deliberate. And if there's one thing that you remember from this, it's that your case should be a narrative, right? It should be a story, just one cohesive kind of concept that the judge should be able to repeat back to you by the end of the round. Your case should be written as a story, not as a group of cards or like evidence or impacts or numbers. It should be a story. And all of the things that you write in the case are a part of that story. And this story should be pushed by you in as many places as possible. So obviously you read it for 4 minutes, but it should also appear in your rebuttal. Maybe you give cross applications to your case, maybe you're frontlining, and of course it should appear very heavily in the second half of the round in your summary and final focus. So by the end of the round, the judge should be able to tell back to you what the story of your case is, not with evidence. Maybe, you know, if they remember cards, that's good. But the idea here is that the focus is on the story. What makes sense? All right. So what makes a good story? Anyone can answer. Just chime in. Just in general, what makes a good story? Like a good movie, a good book. Anybody?
Having a beginning, middle, and end.
Sure. That's definitely important. Having good structure. Anyone else? All right. What makes a good fairy tale? We've all read fairy tales.
Having a lesson at the end.
Okay, sure. Yeah, having some sort of moral. Yep. I see Asa and Olivia are both unmuted.
I don't know if this would apply to debate, but good characters.
Sure, good characters. And with that, there's some sort of sympathy as well. So in debate, you probably wouldn't name specific people, but also you know, having some sort of human connection. That definitely is important in debate. Okay, I think those are all good ideas. So we talked about structure, having some sort of value, you know, which is more of an LD thing, but it definitely applies to public forum, as well as having some sort of connection. Those are all things that very much apply to debate and should be considered when you're writing your case. But let's talk about some specifics. These are the goals of the constructive. So first and foremost, create a cohesive narrative. Now, I mentioned yesterday that I'm a big fan of pre-writing bits and pieces of the round. So this is kind of what I mean when I say introduce rhetoric to be used in later speeches. So there should be certain phrases that you use in your constructive that you will repeat word for word later in round. This can be a tagline. This might be a short explanation for something. It might be the title of your impact. But there should be certain small phrases that you repeat throughout the round so that it can kind of jog the judge's memory. Now, if you choose to write out your extensions, which I would recommend, then it's very easy to denote specific places where you're going to include rhetoric that is repeated. All right, highlight important pieces of evidence. So this goes below the narrative kind of goal of the constructive. However, it is ideal if you can, for example, say a certain name of an author or bring up the name of a study and have the judge remember it. You'll probably have very important cards that you know that you want to extend in your case. Usually these are impact cards, right? Certain numbers that you definitely want the judge to remember. On the app, that might be like 45,000 lives are lost due to uninsurance. On the neg, it might be how much money hospitals lose, things like that. You'll come across very similar cards on this topic, but when you're writing the constructive, you know which cards you want to extend throughout the round. That should be pretty intuitive. And so you want to not only highlight them in your case, but also extend them throughout the round. So in your case, that might appear in the form of like using some sort of language around that impact or that other piece of evidence, saying, or that's why so-and-so finds this, or that's why so-and-so critically finds this, or importantly. Just dropping in little words here and there to denote which pieces of evidence are more important than others, because that definitely is true. Okay, and provide multiple options for late round strategy. So we all have had at least a year of debate experience, and we all know that things go poorly in rounds sometimes. And sometimes there are things that we cannot anticipate and responses that we have no idea how to address. So when you're writing your constructive, you should anticipate that. You'll see, or you might remember from the round yesterday, each of them had, I think, 2 subpoints, and within those subpoints, several warrants. Now, I was not a fan of the AF case, and the neg case was all right. But you can see what they intentionally tried to do there. They were aware of the fact that their opponents could definitely take out one of their arguments, and so they had several options. And within those options, they also had different warrants. So if something went haywire, they could definitely have some sort of access to their impact. So let's talk about some concrete examples. On the AF, you might be arguing accessibility. So you might have several reasons why there's a lack of accessibility in the status quo. One might be discrimination, one might be cost, one might be unemployment and recessions. So in that case, you have several warrants into people not having access to healthcare. On the neg, you might have several links into longer wait times. Those could be hospital closures or doctor shortages. So in that case, you could drop either one of those and still have one viable warrant for the end of the round. So just generally have several options on the table. Okay, what makes an argument? Now, anyone can chime in here. I'm looking for specific terminology, but just take a guess, anybody. There are 5 things.
A combination of logos, ethos, and pathos.
Okay, that definitely is applicable, but not exactly what I'm looking for. Olivia, you can just chime in, by the way. You don't have to raise your hand.
And impact.
I heard impact. I didn't hear the other ones though.
Claim and a warrant.
Okay, I heard warrant also.
Claim.
Claim, yes, claim, warrant, impact. Good. That's 3 out of 5. I'm looking for 2 more. Impress me, somebody. That's okay. All right, claim, warrant, impact. Oh, Jake?
Contention.
Contention. That kind of is the argument, but that's a good guess.
A link chain?
Link, yes. All right, there's 1 more. All right, that's okay. I didn't expect anyone to get. All right, good. So we're all pretty familiar with the parts of an argument. So the one I was looking for is uniqueness. But good. We got 4 out of 5. That's great. So I'll just walk you through each of these parts. So claim, what's your argument? That really is just your tagline of your contention. So that's a no-brainer right there. Uniqueness. So it's really important to establish what's happening right now. If you're on the AF, you want to say that things are bad right now, and so that we need to make a change. On the neg, you want to say that things are good, and so that we should keep the status quo, or that the AF would make things worse. So uniqueness is not only essential to avoiding non-uniques, but also to kind of set the scene. So as Jake pointed out in answering the previous question, good stories have beginning, middles, and ends, and this is kind of your beginning here. Right, your exposition, if you will. And of course, perhaps this kind of argument structure also follows the structure of a story. So you have to provide some sort of context for the judge also, so that they can kind of warm up to the idea, get a general sense of what's happening, provide background info. So that's the uniqueness there. Usually this doesn't have to be long, but it should provide good context. All right, moving on. Link, how does the resolution affect the status quo? that's pretty straightforward, and I think that's generally pretty easy to understand. So, how will voting, change things? Now, the warrant here explaining the link, this is very important, especially at higher levels of debate. And oftentimes, JV debaters neglect this. And as you saw in the round yesterday, the AF team especially did not extend their warrants. And as a result, their narrative was a lot less cohesive. And it would have been a lot harder to recall what their argument was, and it simply seemed less persuasive. So warrants are explaining the link, so why something is true. And it's a little bit abstract to just kind of explain it, but when you're writing your speech, you can think about things strategically. Warrants are places where you can create those multiple options. Right? If you have multiple explanations for something, that is ideal, because if one is taken out, then you still got others. And this is also a place where you can be more creative. I personally am a big fan of running stock arguments because I don't know, I just think that squirrely arguments kind of defeat the purpose, and it gets of debate, and it kind of gets into an evidence battle. So I like stock arguments, but that also means that the opponents always have blocks. So places where you can get around that issue is in the warranting. Right? I can have a stock claim, a stock link, and a stock impact, but if my warrant is unique and my explanation is unique, then that gets around stock responses. Finally, impact. So what's the significance of the argument? And terminalize. That is also something that JV debaters neglect, and something that even the neg team kind of didn't really do very well yesterday either. So Asa mentioned characters, right? Characters are important parts of stories, and the reason is that oftentimes we can sympathize with characters because they're also humans, right? That's how we connect with stories. And that's what terminalization is, right? You're not going to talk about specific people, but terminalization is how it affects the human life. And I think Asa also mentioned logos, pathos, ethos. This is where your pathos comes in. So when you're talking about poverty, for example, you can talk about how these people don't have access to necessary things to survive, right? Basic things like food, water, housing, they can't afford all of that. And so they're living a life that is dehumanized, right? And their life is a constant struggle just for survival. Things like that need to appear in your speeches. And oftentimes debaters underestimate how important that is. To be honest, in a lot of your rounds, you can really neglect the tech. You don't have to, answer 100% of arguments, but what's oftentimes more important is the narrative, and terminalization is a part of that as well. One thing to keep in mind, the vast majority of your judges in general are going to be lay or not super tech. You're almost never going to have very rarely going to have a serious tech judge, maybe like once or twice a tournament. So prepare to be persuasive, and that's where terminalization comes in. One thing that I will just anticipate in your case writing, especially on the neg, people talk about doctor shortages and hospital closures, but you have to terminalize that to, for example, mortality. Just saying that there are going to be less doctors and less hospitals is not particularly persuasive. All right, and just to wrap this slide up, the reason why we have this sort of chain of parts of the argument is that it's kind of a logical flow. So problem, solution, impact, kind of beginning, middle, end, if you will. This is what makes most sense to the judge. Okay, components of contention, just general review. First, you start with your tagline. Stan will probably tell you to have something catchy there. I usually did not, because I was too lazy and not clever enough. If you want to do something catchy, that makes it more fun, but you don't have to. Don't make it too cheesy though. Yeah, so that's the tagline. And of course, then the argument, which should be a mix between analysis and evidence. I think I alluded to this briefly yesterday, but your evidence should be weaved or interwoven with your analysis. I saw in some of the cases yesterday that it was just tagline card. I saw this in a bunch of cases. And that's okay, but at the higher level of debate, your analysis and your evidence should interact together. So you should be using phrases like, this explains why so-and-so. So just so that there's more continuity between your evidence. right? Because when you just read evidence in blocks, that's less cohesive to the judge, and that's less persuasive, and it just sounds like a laundry list of evidence. But if you can weave it into a sort of speech, then that's something that the judge is more accustomed to listen to and probably is going to grab onto more. Okay, just as a review, what kind of evidence do you want to look for in research? Talked a little bit about this yesterday. Anybody? What's good evidence? What's a good source?
We talked about this yesterday.
Peer-reviewed studies.
Mm-hmm.
Recent.
Recency, good, good. What else makes a good piece of evidence? One more. Somebody's got to have one more.
An expert in the field.
An expert in the field. Good, good. All things to look for. All right. So just as a quick review, obviously expert, recency, peer-reviewed, any sort of university study, books sometimes okay, and also reputable news sources. I'll get things to look for. Okay. Using evidence. Evidence should support every component of your case. That's pretty clear. Because when people ask you about it and you don't have an author, that can be pretty embarrassing. So again, weave evidence with your own analysis. So link cards together, have them work together. Don't have long chains of evidence. And when you explain things in your own words, that's fine. You can explain things in your own words, but then tie that into some sort of piece of evidence, right? You can have evidence and your own analysis even in the same sentence. All right, and explicitly state your sources. So this is more of like a novice mistake, but this can also apply to varsity debaters because sometimes you don't explicitly state your sources later in round as much as you should. So if you have sources, and again, this goes back to what I was saying about highlighting important pieces of evidence. If you know what those pieces of evidence are, you should be reiterating those throughout the round. Look back to our blank evidence from case. That sort of evidence not only helps to jog the judge's mind, but also makes it seem like you have this cohesive narrative, that you're on top of your evidence, you really know what you're talking about. So you should be able to pick out a few cards before round when you're planning that you know you want to extend and you know that are important to your narrative, and those should be extended. Also, I know like some very tech judges will want you to extend author names. So, all right, here's kind of it all just tied together. And fortunately, this is on a topic that I saw a lot of you debated as well. So this is UBI revitalizes the job market. There's my tag. And I start with the uniqueness. So currently, countless Americans are stuck in low quality of jobs. All right, so let's look at the first two cards. This is kind of an explanation, a more concrete example of how to weave evidence together. So, all right, Eric Sherman says that a lot of them are underemployed. Great. Now, Booker explains that many corporations use threats of outsourcing automation to leverage into lower wages. So you see there, the second one explains the first one, and that creates more continuity. And the rest of it is more contextualization. And okay, look again, the Schroeder and the United Way. So the United Way kind of takes the Schroeder evidence one step further as a result. These are all sort of little language things that you can use in your own speeches that I would encourage. So saying things like explain, as a result, critically, this means that. All this stuff kind of ties your speech together. All right, now my link is UBI would improve productivity, and then comes my warrant. Turn down bad jobs, retraining, start a business. Okay, ultimately Ralajad concludes, substantial increase in productivity. That's fine. Now this is where actually in my original contention, I had two different warrants here because I anticipated that people would probably respond to this one. So again, that's an example of just having multiple options in round. So two warrants is definitely okay. All right, the impact of a strong job market is a vibrant society. This kind of ties back into what Asa was talking about with pathos, vibrant society. Sometimes language like this just makes it a little bit more apparent to the judge what's going on, especially lay judges. The terminalization here isn't great, but Johnson at the end does kind of summarize the effects of poverty: health issues, increased crime, lack of education. So of course I have all sorts of statistics about how much GDP increases, etc. But the important part comes at the end. Johnson writes that poverty leads to all of these issues. Now, one thing that I will also bring up that you should keep in mind when you're writing your case: you should be able to deliver your case as if you were just giving a speech, or as if you were writing an essay for your history or your English class. Because at the end of the day, you're persuading a person, right? This is a persuasive speech. A lot of the time, especially new varsity debaters are too enamored with tech, right? And they think that just throwing in a bunch of cards is the best idea, but it's not, because it's persuasive. So write it as a speech, not as a debate case. Okay, moving on, writing tips. All right, these are kind of things that I've picked up on over the years. So first, very explicitly indicate new sections of case. I'm sure that you all have been around and been listening to cases and just been wondering, where the heck does this end? What part are you on? Especially when it's something you don't understand. That also means that the judge was very lost in the case as well. So use phrases like "the impact is," or "however," or "thus Medicare for all will cause." You should explicitly indicate these new sections because it shows that you have structure, and it shows where that beginning, middle, and end is. Another thing, concise writing is easier to comprehend. A lot of the times, as debaters, there just aren't enough words in the case. Right? We're limited by time, and so we want to fit in as much as possible. Well, the good news is that the shorter your writing is, and the more concise it is, the easier it is to understand. If you have long phrases or unnecessary words or adjectives, that just confuses the sentence. You want to have short, simple sentences as much as possible. Of course, you want to have some sort of variance in order to keep it interesting, but you should have concise writing. Okay, and finally, omit anything unnecessary. And this is definitely something that is very important. Ask yourself these questions. Will this card ever be extended in the second half of the round? Is it important to my narrative at all? Ask yourself, if I take it out, will my case be fine? A lot of the times, if you're at the point of asking yourself, you can probably take it out. And finally, will my framework or definitions ever be contested? I myself have never ever heard a definition that was helpful to the round. I mean, there are times, obviously, when resolutions can be contested and it's a little bit vague. In this case, you probably don't need to define anything. Framework, if you're just running a cost-benefit framework, don't do that, because that is just the default in public forum. There's no need to establish that. On the AF, however, that may be a case in which you do want to run a framework, because it could be more important, especially on this topic. All right, what is framework, and how might it help you later in round? Anybody have any ideas? Feel free to chime in. Anybody?
It's kind of just like how you want the judge to do the overall round.
Sure. Good. Anyone else?
It's like the lens in which you view the round. So if
Good.
like your framework is minimizing oppression, whoever minimizes oppression best is the side that wins.
It's kind of like a weighing mechanism for the whole round.
Sure. Yeah, this is kind of another way to weigh. Another way to think about it is which impacts should be evaluated first. So if you win a certain impact, then that precedes all others. Now, how might this be useful to you in the round?
If you win on framework, then like your case is already adjusted to your framework, so that gives you a big advantage.
Sure. Good point. Another way to think about it, if you win under the framework that you set, then your opponents can win whatever other impacts they want to, but you would still win. So this creates a huge advantage to you in the round, and this kind of is related to the weighing that Jake was talking about. If you set a good framework and you win it, and you're the only team that has those sorts of impacts, then all you have to do is win under your framework. And then you can really, you shouldn't, but you could technically concede your opponent's case and you should still be able to win. So clearly that is a huge strategic advantage. So if a framework is appropriate, go ahead and use it. All right, so default is util. Now, if you're on the neg and you want to use util, you could say that states are not moral actors, right? And that as policymakers, like the only real efficient way to come to any sort of decision is by util, because there's so many different measures of morality, so many different ways that you could approach a moral framework that we would be engaged in an endless debate, right? And there are so many different, there's so many different ways to measure that. However, util provides the only concrete way to actually come to a decision. So maybe that's why you want to prefer util. Provide warranting. Okay, this is very important. And as I'm sure you all noted in the round yesterday, there was very little warranting for the framework. And so it just becomes a he said, she said, or two ships passing in the night, as some might say. Warranting is very important for your framework. If you're the AF and you want to have a special framework, you better warrant the heck out of it, because otherwise the judge is not going to buy it. Cost benefit analysis is very easy for people to understand, because that's the way that we just run our lives, right? In terms of numbers and opportunity costs. So if it's something that's unconventional, you have to be very persuasive about it. This is another place where you can talk about pathos. And for example, if you're in the AF running a discrimination framework, this is also kind of where you can terminalize a little bit, talk about the terminal effects of discrimination on human beings. On the other side, if you're responding to the AF framework with the util, you have to provide some sort of warranting. What I said just now in the lecture should be okay. That's something that you could use. Either side should have warranting. All right, adopt a non-util framework. I would encourage you all to try this out. Even if it's uncomfortable for you, especially as you go into the higher levels of debate. Oftentimes, people are also unprepared for that, so that can be a little bit helpful. All right. We're going to have another lecture on weighing mechanisms tomorrow, but I just want to briefly touch it today. So, can someone tell me what kind of weighing mechanisms can we use?
Magnitude.
Yes, and scope, time frame.
Probability.
Good. All the biggies. All right. Most of the time you'll be using those. Magnitude, time frame, probability. Scope, also bright line, reversibility, and I added prerequisite here as well. Prerequisite isn't really like a weighing mechanism in the same sense that the others are, but it also is a very effective way to kind of put your argument before your opponents. So anticipate how to outweigh your opponents. Again, a lot of things can be pre-written. When you're writing your case, you should have in mind how your impact is going to outweigh. For AF, this could very easily be magnitude, 45,000 lives saved per year. On neg, you might anticipate running a prerequisite argument saying that hospitals have to be open in order for people to even access care, or doctors have to be available for people to access care. Let's see. Reversibility, obviously lives, everyone uses that. Losing a life is irreversible. Scope, if you're on the neg, you might run scope, because then your impacts about harming the healthcare system affect everyone in the country, right? And I think Samir mentioned that briefly in yesterday's round, like all 300 million people. This can be pre-written. I enjoyed pre-writing my weighing mechanisms. You can literally just read them at the end of summary. That makes things so much easier. So if you have time, you and your partner should discuss, how are you going to weigh? And you can have it written out, last 30 seconds of summary, just set aside to literally read through your weighing mechanisms. That is a piece of cake. And especially for varsity debaters, that's important. And even if you have time in rebuttal, you can, if it's pre-written, you can just read it in rebuttal if you have time. Now, if you have multiple impacts, that there are multiple options then for you to weigh, and you have a lot of different weighing mechanisms. All right, strategic considerations. I don't know why there's a plain photo here. Oh, I guess this is terminal. I didn't add the pictures. Yeah, terminal, that's cheesy. Okay, as I said before, I prefer stock arguments because these are often more true. You probably already have a sense of what the stock arguments are on this topic because, I mean, of course, we saw the round yesterday. You've done a little bit of research, and also in our kind of research competition yesterday, I tried to hit those stock arguments. So you probably generally know what these stock arguments are. Not only is there the most evidence on these arguments, they're also probably the most true. What that means is that it's going to be most persuasive to a lay judge. You don't have to go through the work of explaining something that is extremely obscure or involves lots of different cards. If something is basic and intuitive, then that is the easiest thing and the easiest story for the judge to understand. And also, when you're thinking about tournaments, these are also the arguments that the judges are going to be hearing the most. So you're already at an advantage. If you're in like round 3 or 4 running a stock argument for a lay judge, that lay judge has already heard your argument, so they already get it. All right, one contention cases pose potential risks, but create a more cohesive narrative. This is what I generally prefer toward the later stages of my career. One contention cases really do make the story a lot easier. When you have two contentions, that there are a lot of things that are left in the judge's mind. Sometimes lay judges feel like if you drop one, then that's weak, but also you don't really want to extend more than one contention. So from the get-go, if you only have one contention, that's only one story that the judge has to remember, and that's one kind of thesis that is very clear. Now, of course, there's the risk that you get turned, or there's a great D-link, or whatever else. They might have great responses to your one contention, and that's where multiple links and multiple impacts are important. When I debated with my partner, we would kind of brainstorm what impact we wanted to go for, and we would just come up with as many links and warrants as possible so that at the end of the round, even if like 2 out of 3 were taken out, we still have that one. And even if their responses to all 3, I would only have to frontline one of those 3 links. That makes things a lot easier for you. All right, terminal defense. This is a little bit more nifty here. Sometimes, actually Stan and I were talking about this morning. Oftentimes, your case will interact with the other opponent's case. And especially on this topic, there are a lot of stock arguments. You can pretty easily anticipate what the other team is going to say. And sometimes terminal defense makes sense as a part of your story. It's a little bit abstract to just say this, but sometimes it can be very clever and strategic to include terminal defense kind of hidden in your case, hidden in part of your narrative, so that you can already anticipate responses.
Could you explain to me terminal defense? I've heard that term thrown around a lot, and I don't really understand it.
Yeah, basically, so it's just anything that completely takes out the other opponent's case. So usually that's just like D-link, might be a non-unique. Yeah, nothing too complicated. Yeah, all right. Save on offense for rebuttal overviews. If you have too many cards, or if you have another contention that doesn't fit, this could be construed as abusive, but if you're the first rebuttal, you might save some of that extra evidence for offense at the top of rebuttal. There is, in the file I'll share with you, there is a neg overview that is pretty nice. You might want to use that. All right, and finally, how will my case interact with my opponent's narrative? So as I said before, cross applications further the narrative. You can probably keep, regardless of which side you're assigned to, you can probably anticipate what your opponents are going to say. So you can also plan out how to cross apply your own case. And oftentimes these responses are what you want to use because they're a chance to re-explain your case and hammer home your narrative one more time to the judge. So these cross applications are generally good responses to make because they really further the narrative. All right, questions to ask yourself. Does my case flow through like an essay? Remember, this is persuasive. It is English. It is not debate language. Can my case be turned? Ideally, if you have a choice, you want to use contentions that can't be turned, because obviously those are things that you don't have to respond to if things go haywire and if you drop. And finally, how do I explain my contention in 1 minute, 30 seconds, or 1 sentence? So you should be prepared to do really all 3 of these things. In rebuttal, you want to really briefly potentially explain your contention if you're using a cross application. In summary, as I said yesterday, I would heavily recommend starting out with it can be a pre-written extension of your case, maybe in 30 seconds. And finally, 1 sentence. So this might come into play when you're frontlining. In second rebuttal, you would say, all right, let's go back to our case on our first contention on increasing accessibility to healthcare. We say that Medicare for All provides accessibility to millions of Americans and saves tens of thousands of lives. Let's talk about their responses. So just sort of 1 sentence there, not only to jog the judge's memory, but also to reinforce your narrative as quickly as possible. All this can be pre-written, nothing to stress about. All right, final thoughts. Anticipate and work around responses. So again, usually stock arguments on this topic. So you know what they're going to say. The way to address this, I would recommend, is having unique warrants. They don't even have to be unique. As long as you can just explain it really well and it makes a lot of sense, oftentimes that is enough. So warranting is very important there. All right, next, summary extensions should mirror your case. Again, going back to rhetoric that you want to extend, certain pieces of evidence, terminalization. These are all things that can be pre-written, and also you should discuss these with your partner. When you're writing your case, you know what's strong, you know what's weak, you know what they're going to say. So you should ideally decide, even before the round starts, what you want to go for. And so you should really know what your summary is going to look like in advance. And finally, everything in your case should be deliberate. So don't just throw things in your case because it could potentially be offense, or it's a good card, or it's a good stat. Everything in your case should be deliberate. It should be a part of this story, right? So as I conclude, that's the main thing that I want to emphasize. Your case should be a narrative. It is a story. It's not just debate cards, it is a story. Think about how persuasive it is. If you had to explain it to your grandma or your parents or your cat, right? If you say it to your parents and they understand what your argument is, then you're probably on the right track. Because at the end of the day, you probably will be convincing a parent in round. Okay, that is all I have for this lecture. Does anyone have any final questions? No. Okay. All right. Excellent. So we're going to take a break now. We'll break until, let's say, 10:25. And when we come back, we're going to start working on cases. All right. I'll see you all in about 20 minutes. Same room. We'll be in here.